I'm Paul Freedman. I was Humanities Center Director between 1993 and 1997, and since I think I'm the only one of the presiders who isn't resident in Nashville, let me add my very fond recollections of being here, of the Warren Center, of Mona Frederick's leadership, for which I was merely window dressing, and the wonderful times and intellectual stimulation that I experienced as a Humanities Center Director. I'm very glad to be presiding over this panel, the final one of the day, Globalization and Diaspora. And we will be hearing first from Deborah Cohn, who is Professor of Spanish and American Studies and Chair of the latter department at Indiana University. She has written a number of books, including The Latin American Literary Boom and U.S. Nationalism During the Cold War, which Vanderbilt published. History and Memory in the Two Souths, Recent Southern and Spanish American Fiction, also published by Vanderbilt. She co-edited with John Smith, Look Away, the U.S. South in New World Studies, and her research interests include Cold War cultural diplomacy, Spanish American and Latino literature, the Cold War 20th century inter-American literary and cultural relations, and everything related to William Faulkner. She was visiting fellow in 2000-2001 when the theme was Rediscovering the New World, Exploring Lines of Contact among the Americas and within the United States. Deborah Cohn.
It's a pleasure to be here today and to be back here today. I'm grateful to Mona for this opportunity, but also for the opportunity for which I originally came here, the chance to work with colleagues who became friends and incredible interlocutors on a project that helped both to center and decenter my research on inter-American literary dialogues, and that it opened it up in numerous ways and to different disciplinary approaches from those that I had previously explored. Like the friendships that I developed here, this experience is something that I bear with me in my research as well as in my own position now in a Department of American Studies that's both hemispherically and transnationally oriented. And I speak here today as someone who comes from this background, and you'll notice that Paul did not mention globalization and diaspora as being in areas of my teaching and not areas of my specialization or particular research. So I hope you'll bear with me if my take on the topic reflects my own positioning as much as anything else. Humanist that I am, I'm nevertheless a bit of an empiricist, and I'm always most comfortable speaking from and about what I know best. So I'll foreground these in the next few minutes. I'll foreground in this next few minutes several texts and currents that raise key issues for me on the subject of this session. As a lit scholar, I'd like to start with a quote from a novel that speaks to a number of these issues. In Junot Díaz's 2007 novel, The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, the narrator describes the protagonist's return to his, quote, native land, the Dominican Republic, as follows. Every summer, Santo Domingo slaps the diaspora engine into reverse, yanks back as many of its expelled children as it can. Airports choke with the overdressed, necks and luggage carousels groan under the accumulated weight of that year's cadenas and paquetes. Restaurants, bars, clubs swarm with Quisqueyanos from the world over, like someone had sounded a general reverse evacuation order. Back home, everybody, back home. From Washington Heights to Roma, from Perth Amboy to Tokyo, from Lawrence to San Juan. It's one big party for everybody but the poor, the dark, the jobless, the sick, the Haitian, their children, the Bates, the kids that certain Canadian, American, German, and Italian tourists love to rape. Yes, sir, nothing like a Santo Domingo summer. Now, the passage always speaks to me of the intersections of globalization and diaspora through its depictions of the transnational movements of groups of people, of goods and capital, and of forms of power such as empire, capitalism, and generally white hegemony. Oscar, the protagonist, cannot perform the gender-based expectations of Dominican identity and is rejected as Dominican both in New Jersey, where he lives, and on the island when he returns. His blackness similarly situates him outside of racialized constructions of Dominican identity. His violent death on the island speaks to his inability to perform his or any national identity and is also a product of the corrupt Dominican political system and of the transnational forces, including the long history of U.S. express support for Dominican regimes. Life in the diaspora and in the native land thus alike both fail Oscar. Similarly, while this passage shows that some members of the diaspora returning to display their success and share their cultural and financial capital, the big party that this occasions also fails a large segment of the Dominican population, aggravating those who already live their lives in misery as a result of the conjunction of national, international, and global forces. It is no accident that this novel has generated such tremendous popular and critical attention, including the coveted Pulitzer Prize, awarded notably, quote, for distinguished fiction by an American author, preferably dealing with American life. In this case, Diaz, who self-designates as a Dominican writer, splits open understandings of what exactly constitutes American life, which is precisely the point here. Scholarship on diaspora emphasizes how the phenomenon disrupts nations. As my Bloomington colleagues Michael Martin and Eileen Julian have observed, diasporas are often positioned in opposition to nation. They trouble the ways in which nations construct themselves as homogenous, disrupting ideas of race, gender, and sexuality, bringing to the fore the limits of citizenship, national identity, and belonging. Moreover, diasporas accentuate transnational cultures and diasporic subjectivities as porous and shifting rather than hermetic and static. Conversely, diasporas mask complex forms of dependency and hegemony, especially for poor migrants and their descendants who negotiate worlds constructed by others, end quote. Much recent scholarship similarly demonstrates how responses to diasporic populations affirm national identities that are being threatened, revealing the racialized presuppositions about national identities and citizenship. Diaspora also prompts the forging of new subjectivities and new ways of imagining collective identity within and outside of the nation. It forms new allegiances as well as new modes of cultural expression that are in turn transmitted back and forth within and across local and transnational communities, and that then follow their own trajectories of claiming, modification, synergy, adoption, and adaptation. The transnational movement of people shares deep commonalities with globalization by which it is accelerated, and the attunement of recent scholarship on both diaspora and globalization to questions of empire and imperialism as forces that shape and forces that are to be resisted is also key, and in the backdrop of many of my remarks, but globalization diaspora in 10 minutes or less was more than I could sort of include there. So the opening paragraphs of George Lipsitz's 2001 American Studies in a Moment of Danger crystallized for me a number of important points about both globalization and diaspora and the challenge that both posed to the idea of the bounded nation state. The rapid movement across the globe of people, products, ideas, and images, he writes, seems to undermine foundational certainties, and bear with me, it's a long quote, about the meaning of local and national identities, the value of personal and collective histories, and the solidity of social relationships and social networks. In some respects, global marketing brings the people of the world closer together than ever before, yet consuming the same products does not seem to make us any less divided. Educational institutions, he continues, have trained most of us to think largely in terms of national politics, national histories, and national cultures. Yet the present moment of global social and cultural transformation requires us to develop transnational and postnational as well as national ways of knowing. We see now that industrialization, nationalism, and the Cold War were not just historical processes and events. They were also ways of knowing and ways of being. They trained us to ask how each specific geographic location produced its own specific culture, and to define politics largely in terms of citizenship and the nation state. Yet our actual experiences in today's post-industrial, post-nationalist, and post-Cold War era confront us constantly with cultural practices and political projects that cannot be pinned down to any one place and that supersede the purview of individual states, end quote. Lipsitz further reminds us that, quote, the global economic system is a class system, but it is also a racial system. Built upon the remnants of previous racial regimes, it now produces a proliferation of new forms of differentiation that exacerbate and expand old ethnic and racial conflicts, end quote, yet I would add without disrupting current forms and modes of white hegemony, either in national or international context. And that for me is a framing quote that sets up the next three texts that I just want to single out, which are Paul Gilroy's Black Atlantic, Brent Edwards's The Practice of Diaspora, and Michelle Stevens's Black Empire, all of which examine phenomena phenomena that do pose transnational challenges to white hegemony. And these key texts, all published between 1993 and 2005, examine the creation of discourses of black internationalism and trans and supranational communities and identities, political, racial, gendered, through forms of expressive culture. Their work is emblematic of the move to reveal the cultural practices and political projects in diaspora that cannot be pinned down to any one place, and that were always already there, despite the structures of knowledge that used national frontiers to delimit the boundaries of creative and academic projects. At the same time, their projects speak to the need to expand our frame of reference, our archives, and our interlocutors in order to properly study globalization and diaspora as trans and multinational phenomena. To give but one example, Gilroy's Black Atlantic has provided a powerful conceptual tool for studying the African diaspora in the Americas in the Atlantic during the 25-year period that we're looking at today, but at the same time, it is predicated on the study of patterns of English colonialism. So the works of scholars such as Ifeoma Nwankwo, which brings together the histories of Anglophone, Hispanophone, and Francophone diasporas in multiple nations with different colonial histories, is an important complement. We can't just transpose the idea of the Black Atlantic to study it within the context of, say, Latin America. These are concepts that are useful but that need to be nuanced. Such comparatist work also speaks to the study of diaspora and globalization not as one-way phenomena of dispersion, but as multinodal processes where people and cultures, sometimes separately, sometimes together, travel, are incorporated into new contexts, but also may return to the site of origin and or move elsewhere, where they are in turn adopted, adapted, retransmitted in multiple directions, or resisted. My colleague Marvin Sterling at IU, for example, has studied the popularity of Jamaican cultural forms such as reggae and Rastafari in Japan, and through them demonstrates how ideas of blackness have been constructed within a global context. He has also researched Japanese interest in Jamaican blackness through both literary representation and communities on the island. Jason McGraw, in turn, is studying the role of Jamaican popular music in efforts to decolonize the island and create a national culture, at the same time that it was also disseminated by immigrants in England and the U.S. and became a site of global exchange. Such research projects thus trace global phenomena through deep attention to the particular, to different diasporas, to the specific stages on which such phenomena take place, and to the broader power dynamics that frame them. Such projects require methodology and training that allows for the consideration of both archives and scholarly production in the pertinent nations and languages, as well as bringing scholars from multiple sites into the conversation so as not to continue to reproduce within a transnational academic context patterns of hegemony that have dominated the international political sphere. So I'd like to conclude by shifting gears just a bit. This past May, Alexander Wang, a professor of English and International Affairs at George Washington University, gave a briefing to Congress on globalization and the humanities in the 21st century. He advocated powerfully for the humanities and for the continued public support thereof on the grounds that the skills that they teach, and here we return to the instrumentalist and utilitarian argument we were having this morning, on the grounds that the skills that they teach, quote, are vital to American values of freedom, liberty, and social equality, and a democratic society founded upon the government's accountability and rational citizen participation, end quote. He also made the case that the humanities allow college students to better understand how globalization works in terms that his specific audience could understand. There will be no national security without an in-depth understanding of our own culture and the cultures of others. Statistics and numbers give us only a partial picture of international affairs. Thoughtful and engaged citizens are the foundation of a democratic civil society. He further argued that knowledge of cultural globalization can help us avoid cultural imposition and move towards cultural sharing and building common ground. The argument, again, is instrumentalist, aimed at convincing an audience that, as we well know, is not always known for its appreciation of the humanities and of the need to support them. But it also speaks of issues of concern to us here today. Cultural sharing is imbricated in processes of globalization and diaspora, and how we study and teach these processes has ripple effects both inside and outside of the academy and inside and outside of the U.S. as well. Avoiding cultural imposition, likewise, is an important challenge for us all in all of these contexts, and is one that we need to bear in mind in terms of our approaches, methodologies, and communities of interlocutors.
Thank you very much, Professor Cohn. Our next speaker is Nihad M Farooq, who is Assistant Professor of American Studies at Georgia Institute of Technology. She's mainly interested in American and African American studies, in transatlantic epistemologies of race and science in the 19th century. Her first book, just completed, is entitled Undisciplined Transatlantic Personhood and the Science of Diaspora, 1830 to 1930. She is currently working on a second project, Virtual Emancipation, Slavery and Social Networks in the New World. She was here as the visiting fellow in 2012-13. The program was The Age of Emancipation, Black Freedom in the Atlantic World.
Thank you. It's an honor to come together on this auspicious occasion of the 25th anniversary of the Warren Center, and it's both exciting and a somewhat daunting task to discuss the changes in humanistic inquiry surrounding globalization and diaspora in the past 25 years. So I will do that through the very focused lens of my own scholarship here, the growth of which was made possible through the generosity of everyone I met and worked with at the Warren Center. And as someone who was just here last year, this has been a particularly lovely homecoming for me and a wonderful space for new affiliations and friendships. So thank you to Mona, to Allison, to Tyler, to Emma, and of course to Ed and Carolyn and everyone else who worked so hard to make sure that we could be here together then and now. So, as with many of the other themes explored in the Warren Center seminars and with the commemorative panels organized here today, we see that the most exciting aspect of humanistic dialogue is that it is itself a kind of intellectual diaspora in constant process and translation, moving across geographies and temporalities as quickly as scholarly work and publishing cycles allow it to move. It's been particularly exciting for me to have come of age as a scholar through these intellectual movements from the burgeoning lens of post-colonial studies that began for me with an early course I took as a first-year undergraduate student called Migration and the Loss of Geographic Innocence. This was in the very early 90s. And then through the transatlantic and transnational turn in American studies, and now through my own work at the Warren Center, an exploration of how contemporary communication networks might help us rethink the diffuse global networks of the New World archipelago. As Caribbeanist scholars like Edward Glissant have described, these diasporic communities merged the histories of Europeans, Africans, and indigenous populations together in a complicated web that mirrored the sociocultural fluidity that is the idealistic image of today's virtual web, with its own, quote, historiographic turbulence and its ethnological and linguistic clamor, end quote. Benitez Rojo described this New World space as a repeating island, not unlike today's expansive internet, continuously, quote, unfolding and bifurcating until it reaches all the seas and lands of the earth, while at the same time it inspires multidisciplinary maps of unexpected design, end quote. Like images of the contemporary internet universe, the culture of this historic meta-archipelago also resists mapping and situatedness because it is similarly rhizomatic, quote, a network spreading either in the ground or in the air with no predatory rootstock taking over permanently, end quote. Slave networks of this earlier period, diverse, invisible, and proliferating, I argue, were like the virtual global networks of today, traceable primarily through the flow of information. Slave experience in the New World, as my own work explores it, is not intended to stand as a symbolic or heroic origin story of contemporary diasporic and global networks. Rather, what this comparison seeks to encourage is in part a reconceptualization of diasporic temporality and race as technologies of New World political formation. As Wendy Chun has elegantly argued, a reconfiguration of race as technology allows us to shift the focus from the what of race to the how of race, from knowing race to doing race. It also collapses the manufactured distance between disciplinary practices such as biology, engineering, art, and culture, which are part of the same technological apparatus of making, unmaking, and becoming. Without this shift in focus from disciplinary and disciplining spaces to an interdisciplinary process that emphasizes the productive centrality of race in the construction of globality, there can be no radical politics of difference, only the mapping, ordering, managing, or obliteration of it, all of which are byproducts of an old disciplinary order invested in the fiction of stasis. A facile reading of the information age might lead us to utopian conclusions about the democratic potential of today's diasporic networks and the long-anticipated arrival of a global electronically mediated revolution, as theorist Marshall McLuhan had forecast, in which there are finally, quote-unquote, no secrets. But a closer look at these earlier New World communities reveals the ways in which networks, as inherently informational and performative, are in fact capable of keeping all manner of secrets, thereby always holding the potential to dismantle the system from the inside. Even the spread of miscommunication in the Black Atlantic, whether through rumor, misinterpretation, or strategic ploy, worked to create community and possibility through information networks and the performance, once again, of a diasporic temporality. Harriet Jacobs' 1861 memoir of her escape from slavery, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, provides several examples of the radical potential of such miscommunication. In one such example, Jacobs recounts the tale of a woman who, quote, begged me to get a newspaper and read it over. She said her husband told her that black people had sent word to the Queen of America that they were all slaves, that she didn't quite believe it, and went to Washington City to see the president about it. They quarreled, she drew her sword upon him, and he swore that he should help her to make them all free, end quote. While Jacobs herself reads this anecdote as indicative of the woman's blissful or utopian ignorance, it nevertheless illustrates, I shouldn't say blissful, I think utopian is better there, but it nevertheless illustrates the sustaining power of information as hope, and shows, as critic Lauren Berlant has written, quote, how the kinds of invention, innovation, and improvisation that Jacobs' illiterate interlocutor practiced with only partial knowledge could be used radically for the reimagination of collective political life within the nation, end quote. The woman's imagining of a female monarchical power that lords over the U.S. president also resituates African Americans in a different political and temporal register, outside the bounded history of a stifling U.S. nationalism, subject instead to a queen justice, and this is a quote from Jacobs, to whom the president was subordinate, end quote, as Jacobs herself would like to imagine. Even when slave rebels called on Republican ideals to make their claims to freedom, they did so by making claims to a country that was in itself a conglomerate nation of Africa, Europe, and the Americas, an Atlantic world identity rooted as much in the sea as it was to any one land. As one of Gabriel Prosser's fellow rebels stated during his trial in the early 1800s, quote, I have nothing more to offer than what General Washington would have to offer had he been taken by the British officers and been put on trial by them. I have ventured my life in endeavoring to obtain the liberty of my countrymen and am a willing sacrifice to their cause, end quote. Whether these words intended to stake a claim in African identity, a specific U.S. African American identity, or a broader Atlantic identity, their utterance in this instance rehearses the flexible parameters of national identification, a stand against colonial oppression that could simultaneously evoke a model of an idealized U.S. nationalist pride, a nostalgic African pride, or a new global diasporic model of citizenship. Such examples, I argue, help us to think about slave temporality as resistant to fixity and situatedness in the same way that information flows, both now and then, are resistant. The slow recalculation of space and time for slaves boarded onto European sailing vessels opened the possibility of a new model of becoming that was inherently mobile, resistant, and political. These reconfigurations by the enslaved, the recognition of the self in diasporic space, the reinsertion of oneself in a different diasporic temporality that resisted the history in which slaveholders tried to embed them, were made possible in part by new networks of affiliation. Slaves in the New World understood what it meant to negotiate layered and often competing temporalities, in part through their construction of networks made across cultural, linguistic, religious, national, and familial boundaries. The instability of a unified temporal and geographic structure was constitutive of the New World experience and eventually became one of the most powerful strategies of slave organization. New World slave rebels reached across these layered temporalities and made history, as historian Walter Johnson has argued, by remaking time. Although the study of these stories is not new, the evolution of fields like post-colonial studies, network theory, Black internationalism, and transatlanticism, and their interdisciplinary crossings have helped add a new dimensionality to our examination of lived histories and narratives. The Robert Penn Warren Center has been encouraging these kinds of bridges and crossings since its inception and will always be at the forefront of how ideas and bodies move across disciplines and histories and temporalities. I'm grateful to have been a part of that long history and to continue to be so, and I look forward to future conversations about it from today onward. So, thank you.
And thank you so much. Our next speaker is Sharon Kazmir, professor of anthropology at Hofstra. She specializes in labor and working class cultures, the author of The Myth of Mondragon, Politics, Cooperatives, and Working Class Life in a Basque Town. She's co-editor of a forthcoming book entitled Difference and Dispossession Towards a Global Anthropology of Labor. And she's done field work in the Basque region of Spain, as well as in Tennessee. She's the recipient of grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Social Science Research Council, and the Fulbright Program. She was the visiting fellow in 1998-99, the program titled Inventing Work.
Thank you. I want to add my thanks to the Robert Penn Warren Center, to Mona, and to my colleagues in the Inventing Work seminar. We had a great time, and I got a lot out of my year here, including I was able to do the fieldwork project that I had envisioned at the Saturn plant, just a few miles down 65. And I'll just start with a disclaimer, which is that I'm an anthropologist in a field that's situated and has always been situated on the fault line between social sciences, the natural sciences, and the humanities. And I find myself in the social sciences domain of that most often, and so I feel a bit of a disclaimer is in order, because I really force myself to stick to the humanities edict here and to look at the term globalization and secondarily diaspora over the last 25 years in the humanities. So on the key word globalization, historian Frederick Cooper wrote that there are two problems with the term. The first is the global, and the second is the ization. And joking aside, he meant this critique quite sincerely. Global tries to capture a set of connections that rightly recognizes that political, economic, and cultural processes do not take place in national and continental containers, financial, capital, and markets being exemplars. But the term global does not sufficiently recognize the limits to those connections, nor does it specify the structures or the connecting mechanisms at work. More and significantly, the word overlooks the unevenness of political, economic, and cultural relations. It overlooks inequality. It smooths out the lumpy parts where power coalesces and where it does not. Global has totalizing pretensions, which are belied by the facts on the ground. Ization in its term implies that the process is going on now, and that in some way it's not happened before, at least in this form. Ization to Cooper is ahistorical in that it fails to deal with the networks and relations across space that have been very much in evidence in earlier periods, in which my two co-discussants here have already talked about the slave trade or the spread of Christianity or Islam or ancient trade routes. I'll speak to this phenomenon. The point for Cooper is not to extend the global back in time or to qualify it with regard to inequality or power. Rather, he wants to get more precise terms to describe the kinds of relationships and spatial configurations that are made as capital, labor, and ideas move across space. And in this regard, he looks to C.L.R. James and also to the literature on the Black Atlantic to trace those kinds of connections. But case in point that was interesting to me as an anthropologist is the oppositional pairing that we were so familiar with of the local and the global, which was a much recited one in anthropology in the 1990s. And a good deal has been written on the local responses or resistance to the global or homogenizing pressures. Cooper argues, quote, that global should be contrasted to the local, even if the point is to analyze their mutual constitution, only underscores the inadequacy of current analytical tools. So if globalization is imprecise, it also encompasses everything and therefore explains little. Always a problem with overused concepts. So globalization, Cooper says, is instead, quote, a significant natives category for anyone studying contemporary politics. Anyone wishing to know why particular ideological and discursive patterns appear in today's conjuncture needs to know how it is used. So that led me to ask, what might interrogating how globalization is used get us? Not in detailing the conceptual imprecision and overreach, as I think Cooper has brilliantly done, but doing an ethnography of its use. So the questions then are, what are the discourses of globalization? What are those discourses being marshaled to do, and for whom? And how has this changed over the last 25 years? And I'll make some suggestions. I don't have the answers to those things, but I'll make some suggestions in the hope of sparking discussions. So of course we would have to look at the WTO, World Bank, NAFTA, Davos, and the like. But our question is, how have the humanities been involved in this project? So it's worthwhile to note, I think, that globalization, different from many of the concepts that we use in academia, has a decisive presence in the public sphere. It's very well used publicly. For example, The Economist first printed the word in 1961 in reference to the need for economic reform in Spain. But then you don't get a mention until the 1980s when the term started to spread to talk about financial and corporate capitalism around the world. But by the end of the decade, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the number of articles and letters to the editor mentioning globalization skyrocketed. And then again with the WTO protest in Seattle in 1999 and Genoa in 2001. The New York Times first mentioned globalization in 1974, just once, and then in 1988 just a couple of mentions, and then a surge in the 90s with a total of nearly 26,000 mentions over that period of time. Many of those references in the Times go back and forth, between two sentiments. One, from a headline in 1994, globalization, it does a world of good, and globalization, it needs a moral compass. So this kind of oppositional pairing points to the way the term is summoned, both as, I think, magical incantation and as needing to be set in a moral frame. And I think a lot of the discourse looks like that. Diaspora, in contrast, first appeared in the New York Times in 1904 and has had 8,000 appearances over that time, kind of consistently. So globalization is clearly a term in wide circulation for the last 25 years, coincident with the life of the Robert Penn Warren Center. Let me point to some of the strands of the use in the humanities. It's been a very busy term, as I came to think of it. It disrupts a lot of our concepts, which I think people have spoken to, and frames and energizes new ones. And I think that's a lot of the work it's been doing. So first, Globalization is used as a critique of area studies, and it's challenged the sovereignty of the nation state by as the challenge to the nation state by global capitalization. It's similarly issued a challenge to the structure of the academy by area studies. That's one thing. Secondly, if globalization has been used as an epistemic challenge to knowledge grounded in the nation state and area studies, it's also been used to disrupt the certainties of culture, identity, and the presumed isomorphism of people, territory, and subjectivity. So that means that questions of citizenship, migration have come to the fore, especially with regard to the study of diasporas. And Stuart Hall and Paul Gilroy's work are early interventions in this regard. And I think this makes Paul Gilroy the single most referred to author today, which I think is very interesting, when they kind of used diaspora to question assumptions about race, gender, and even the Englishness of England's working class. In the last 25 years, research on diasporas, citizenship, migration, and cosmopolitanisms emphasize movement and intersections of people as an alternative ground to the territorial state. And just a quick search on the internet shows that there's been a growth of centers on diasporic studies in the 2000s. Just to mention a few, a new one at SOAS, a new one at University of Toronto, and other places. So I want to ask about those. What new spaces and actors are those centers creating? What are they being marshaled to do? Global's also been used to disrupt culture. In anthropology, this has challenged our object of study. This is to the good, I think, since there's a strong case to be made that the idea of a bounded, fixed, essential culture was always a fiction. But new methods and concepts speak to this critique of a fixed or real culture and suggest how the global can be imagined or seen on the ground. So we have concepts here like hybridity, scapes, flows, roots, and friction. Singh's friction is probably the most concrete of these concepts. It argues that certain actors, places, and processes, in her case building a road for resource extraction, a new settlement of uprooted people in an Indonesian rainforest at the site of a gold mine, a meeting of national politicians with Canadian investors, are points of friction. They're the real and studyable manifestations of the global. There's been a lot of critique of these concepts, most pointedly within our discipline from the social sciences side of things. For example, Arjuna Padurai's influential concept of global flows, ideas, media, finances, among the many, has been criticized for emphasizing the ephemeral and disjunctive over concrete structures, and underestimating the relative power of capital to create, reproduce, and transform geographic spaces, which it does quite unevenly, as we know. While I favor this critique, the point remains that these concepts, methods, and research agendas are among the circulating discourses of globalization and generating a lot of work. In tandem with these discourses, the last 25 years has seen the rise of the argument from radical geography, but spreading to other fields, that making space is a political process. And I think that this has been a very productive turn. Finally, just as a kind of overview, globalization from below, or grassroots globalization, has become a kind of interest. This is the idea that a lot can be learned from the poor, from subaltern groups, from NGOs, and other actors who are themselves creating widespread networks, connections, and solidarities. These actors, the argument goes, these actors have knowledge and ways of knowing about globalization that academics do not, and anthropologists urge us to get involved in engaged anthropology, we call it. Other disciplines have similar projects, to participate with those we study and to capture this knowledge without claiming it as our own. And one extension of this has been the recent discussion of a universalism from below. The articulation of universal discourses of rights, for example, or of the environment by ordinary folks, that re-energizes the universal from a different vantage point. And so I wonder if there isn't something to be done with that and interjected into the conversation. Thanks.
Our final speaker is Professor Jamana Peer, who is Assistant Professor in Anthropology and of African American and Diaspora Studies at Vanderbilt. Her research specialties include African diaspora theory and critical race theory, as well as U.S. immigration policies. And she's the author of Race Across the Atlantic, Post-Colonial Africa and the Predicament of Blackness, which was published by Chicago. She's currently working on a second book entitled Racial Americanization, Conceptualizing Black Immigrants in the U.S. And she was the visiting fellow in 2009-10 when the program's theme was immigration and the American experience. And at that time, she was on the faculty of the University of Texas at Austin.
Thank you. I'd like to join everyone to thank the Warren Center and Mona Frederick, and as well as the directors of the seminar that brought me here back in 2009, Dan Cornfield and Gary Gerstle for the immigration and the American experience. And it was here that I actually finished the manuscript for the first book, and so I'm really grateful for that. The conversations really helped in furthering that project. Today, I'd like to just really trace the term diaspora as opposed to globalization, even though they share semantic field. And so I'll just go right into it. And I'm an anthropologist by training, but I don't have the caveat. So, okay. Diaspora is a term used to describe the mass, often involuntary dispersal of a population from a center or homeland to multiple areas, and the creation of communities and identities based on the histories and consequences of dispersal. The term is not new. It is a Greek word once solely used to describe Jewish, Greek, and Armenian dispersions, what some scholars often describe as the classic diasporas. However, diaspora has gained currency recently both as a conceptual and analytical tool to explain various practices of global movement and community formation. The use of diaspora became very popular in various academic fields in the second half of the 20th century, both in conjunction with and as an alternative to other terms expressing global shifts in movement and identity formation, sharing meaning with a broader semantic field that includes such terms as transnationalism and globalization. While there's a proliferation of works on diaspora that continues to stretch its definitional and theoretical limits, scholars have consistently explored and critiqued a few key theoretical formulations around the concept, namely, 1, the dialectic of homeland to diaspora, 2, the relationship of the nation-state to diaspora, 3, the ways that the condition of diaspora shapes identity formation and cultural production. So diaspora as both concept and theoretical framework really took off, I think, in the 1990s. And this was in part due to the rise of cultural studies, an interdisciplinary field of inquiry variously concerned with the intersection of power and meaning in popular culture. The effects of this influence have been significant, particularly in my two fields of engagement, and that is anthropology and African diaspora studies. Within anthropology specifically, diaspora entered the anthropological lexicon through early ethnographic and theoretical work on the communities of African descent in the New World, and has since attained new epistemological and political resonances. The term was important because it provided a counterpoint to established disciplinary paradigms regarding the formation and stability of cultural groupings, unhinging groups from determinate locales and stretching geographical and social cultural heterogeneity. Thus, a whole new genre of ethnographic studies has been informed by conceptualizations of diaspora, though the term has also been used across the various subdisciplines within anthropology, in archaeology, in linguistic anthropology, in social cultural anthropology, and folklore. Now, while Paul Gilroy's most celebrated book, since everyone wants to talk about the Black Atlantic, is probably what popularized, at least for some, diaspora. The African diaspora, as both concept and theoretical framework, has a much longer and more complex history and genealogy. the origin of the African diaspora anthropology in particular, is usually attributed to the scholarship of anthropologist Melville Herskovits. However, Herskovitz's ethnographic and theoretical approach to the African diaspora, particularly the relationship of Africa to African-descended populations in the New World, was informed by exchanges with African-American, Afro-Caribbean, and Latin American scholars such as W.E.B. Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson, and Jean Price Mars, dating back to the early 20th century. However, it is Herskovitz's famous debate with black sociologist E. Franklin Frazier on the source and nature of African-American culture which had the most impact in the study of African diaspora and anthropology. Herskovits insisted that New World African cultural practices were direct survivals from various cultural areas on the African continent. Frazier, on the other hand, countered that slavery destroyed, for the most part, all traces of African culture among New World populations. This debate has driven ethnography and theory in anthropology and archaeology, impacting research beyond communities of African descent. Significantly, the term black diaspora was first used by anthropologist Sinclair Drake in a book with Horace Caton in 1945 to discuss the internal migration of U.S. blacks in the U.S. From the south to the north. And Drake arguably is singularly responsible for the term's continued elaboration in anthropological research and writing. I think he probably wrote the most essays in books with the term diaspora, African diaspora in it. So that's the important thing. The theoretical trends, this is my specialty, within African diaspora anthropology. To think about this, we have to see how the Herskovits-Frazier debate has spawned two major theoretical and ethnographic trends, which we still see today. The first is the Africanism school, which explores the African cultural presence in the New World among formerly enslaved populations. The second trend, which is probably the most popular based on how often I've heard Gilroy cited here, is the constructionist or hybridity school that argues against any direct African cultural transplants, right? The essentialist kind of transplants that people refer to, and offers a view of culture as syncretic and continuously remade with a number of diverse elements, old and new. These two theoretical trends of the Herskovits-Frazier debate continue to inform contemporary studies of the African diaspora, but with the social constructionist view becoming more prominent of the two since the 1990s. And this is where you have what I call the British cultural studies incursion into African diaspora studies, and the likes of Gilroy and Stuart Hall on the work. So this legacy is marked by some theoretical invocations in trying to understand global black identity formations. That includes culture and racial hybridity, routes over roots, right? The diminishing Africa, right, as a referent, and anti-racial essentialism, right? Anti-essentialism, or what later on, Gilroy would call anti-essentialism. At the same time, most diaspora research has focused not directly on theorizing diaspora alone, most African diaspora research, but also on the cultural politics of race and blackness, as well as relations of power that sustain inequality through the modalities of class, sexuality, gender, and nation. Now, in my own work, I demonstrate how African diaspora studies has stagnated theoretically, I think, since the British cultural studies incursion. This is the past 20 years, so this is the 20th year anniversary of the publication of the Black Atlantic. In particular, African diaspora studies hasn't dealt with some major shortcomings as I see. It hasn't figured out how to deal with Africa as a modern post-colonial space with global relations. And in part, this is one of the consequences of this homeland diaspora dialectic that still confronts the concept. So Africa remains homeland, right, stuck back in somewhere in the 15th century, right, and not accorded the privilege of treatment in terms of hybridity, routes, and ongoing transformation of culture and identity. Linked to that is the privileging of New World Black experiences over African Black experiences, which is which is an interesting thing to think about. And of course, as an aside, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the few works that actually challenge this recently, that actually come and challenge the Black Atlantic. And it's the work by J.L. Matori, which presents a completely different approach to the African diaspora that proposes that continental African and diasporic populations have always been involved in dialogues across the Atlantic, right? So he calls it Afro-Atlantic dialogue, and that their experiences are mutually constituted and constantly being reshaped and made by the communities by one another. The second shortcoming I see is the field hasn't come to terms with the ubiquity of Afrocentrism, for non-academics at least, in popular culture, despite the fact that Gilroy's Black Atlantic and the anti-essentialist movement was actually a direct critique of Afrocentrism. So it's interesting, the work was to displace the Afrocentrism that I think Gilroy saw, particularly in the work of Molefi Asante and his disciples, but it hasn't dealt with the continuous effect of Afrocentrism just practically among populations. In some quarters, particularly within, the other thing I had to say about the shortcomings I see, within the discipline of anthropology and history, the African diaspora studies paradigm seems to be stuck in what St. Clair Dre called the black folk here and there paradigm, right? Where people seem to be content merely documenting the fact of Black presence in different places. And most importantly, to my mind, is a near complete disengagement with political economy and the continuous structural effects of Western hegemony and U.S. imperialism, particularly nowadays with AFRICOM and things like that on the African continent. So, in fact, some of the more innovative deployments of the concept of diaspora has been in relation to scholarship these days on migration, transnationalism, and the current migrations, transnationalism, and globalization, as the forces of post-colonial modern globalization have enabled the massive movement of products, technology, and ideas, and attendant movements and displacements of people. Scholars grapple with the geographical shifts and changing cultural political circumstances of individuals and communities. So some scholars use the diasporic framework these days as they focus either on the links between globalization, culture, and identity, or on the contemporary immigrant communities and the politics of citizenship in the new nations. There is, of course, the risk that in its proliferation as a concept of choice, diaspora as a catch-all risks standing for both too much and too little. This is a discussion that will continue to concern scholars in the near future, particularly as they experience the restructuring of global geopolitics. In the meantime, research, theorizing, and writing using the diaspora framework continue apace. So I will end by mentioning some of the more prominent what I see as early 21st century trends in the study of diaspora, particularly anthropology. These are the use of the diaspora framework, for one, the exploration of the questions of sexuality and desire, two, the exploration of new forms of community and identity in cyberspace, particularly the ways that new immigrant communities use social media and so on to create new forms of nationhood and identity. The linking of class consciousness to labor migration, which importantly challenges the all too common celebratory discussions of global movements, right? And then the exploration of identity in the context of the post-9/11 global war on terror and new imperial structures of domination. So while there'll probably never be consensus on the significance and meaning of diaspora, it is clear that anthropologists and other scholars in the humanities will continue to find its conceptual and theoretical apparatus relevant and useful. In the process, I think they will continue to refine and redefine the term. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your unforced adherence to the draconian time limits imposed by the center. We have some time for questions, comments.
Just in case you think that. Yeah. Just in case you think the argument about, or Gilroy himself has carried the day everywhere, I did a paper on Gilroy about 4 or 5 years ago to a group of U.S. intellectual historians in Boston. And it was like I was talking about not somebody from the moon, but they had hardly heard of him. And so there is, I mean, you can theorize that in all sorts of ways, but one thing would be the ongoing provincialism about the importance of the Black Atlantic, however defined and whatever the weakness is. There's still work to be done in spreading that concept. The other thing I think is that I think the political critique is particularly important. It's hard to know what politics would mean in the Black Atlantic in Gilroyan language. It's a cultural theory. In fact, one of the strong points, on the other hand, is detaching culture from nation state. Those boundaries aren't coincident. So you get overlap and the nation state becomes less important. Finally, I think just an interesting thing, most of his examples are West Indian to New Bronx to London and popular music in the popular cultural area. And you can see both why Africa would get left out, perhaps Francophone Caribbean, and where's Brazil in all this too? The not highbrow, but the intellectual sources are mainly U.S. writers, Du Bois, Morrison, Wright, and a concluding chapter on the two modern diasporic people, Jews and people of African descent, I think is still a kind of tour de force and really an interesting attempt to talk about those two experiences together. Anyway, just some extra comments.
Well, since we're still on the Gilroy train here, I thought that. Well, no, I just, since you guys did a really exemplary job tracing out some of the key terms, one of his key terms is double consciousness. And he talks about it on, what, particularist, racially particularist, nation state. And I think the Diaz quote was really very resonant with his concept of not belonging to any particular nation. And then diasporic. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on sort of the status of the theory of double consciousness as the content of the mentality of this kind of Atlantic thinking and how that has evolved over this period. You mentioned critiques geographically in terms of coverage, but in terms of his mode of analysis of what he articulates as the condition of diaspora, has that shifted? Are there critiques coming from different areas? The nuancing you were alluding to, maybe in the South American context, has that altered that structure, or is it basically still a theory that's respected and held intact, debated?
I mean, I don't know. I was trying to avoid talking about Gilroy primarily because I don't think he should be the marker. I mean, I think, you know, it's an important work, but there's a wide corpus. And so the term double consciousness is from Du Bois, right? And so thinking about you know, I think Gilroy tries to do a lot of different things, and I think, you know, this idea, he starts out by saying trying to be both British and Black. Is that how the book begins, The Black Atlantic, right? Trying to be British and Black, or and so I'm not sure that's the framing he necessarily was thinking about. I thought he meant more of multiple ways of being and seeing the world, which is what Routes is all about, right? So just the movements of people and, you know, multiple ideas, multiple identities, or the fact that, you know, things, you know, are always, was it the politics of always making politics, transgression, transfiguration, right? And so on some level, I think that was important in terms of, you know, seeing identity as multiple and always being made and remade and so on and so forth. And I think a lot of people have caught up with that and have taken that. But I also feel like what they've done is taken it and made it into this like ephemeral cultural thing, and not deal with the actual relationships that are on on the ground. So I mean, I'm not sure if I answered that properly, but you know, I don't know if you
back
guys.
over here. Oh yeah, go ahead, Fisco.
I don't know if is this on? You know, I think that, you know, it's a question of terminology. It's a question sometimes of not fully, you're talking about the stagnation of a discipline around some texts and not fully exploring them. I think that, you know, that there are implications in the of terminology as well as disciplinarity, and I think that double consciousness taken away from Gilroy is very central and clearly in many texts, and many sort of, you know, not just diasporic but also ethnic texts and ethnic groups, and it also requires unpacking, and it requires sort of consciousness of the historiography and consciousness of the history of the term and of the use of the term, and there's sometimes there's use without questioning of terms, and sometimes you know, I think it's valuable to stop and examine the histories. And I mean, one of the concerns that I as a Latin Americanist have with the Black Atlantic is precisely the proliferation of the term. Again, I mean, it has in many ways proved to be. It has stimulated a number of formulations of the diaspora, but on the other hand, I see graduate students looking at the Black Atlantic and then trying to immediately just sort of apply what's in that to other contexts, and that the point of what I was looking at is that we have to be sensitive to the context that we're looking at, the histories, the languages, as well as the relations within which those histories and relations take place.
Question in the back here.
I would like to make 2 points based on some names I've already heard. That's Dr. Malefi Asante, whom I speak with about the music in America and Africa today. And someone else mentioned Dr. W. Du Bois. Dr. Du Bois said that the old spirituals are the greatest gift that the Negro has given to America. And Dr. Y.T. Walker said that it was the only thing that lasts through the slave trade. And Dr. Brad Shore at Emory University Myth and Ritual Department has said that the healing of the American family will start with the old spirituals. And he's Jewish. And so I'm making these points to ask this question: where is this music today that these great scholars have talked about, and especially Dr. W. Du Bois, who said it is the greatest gift that the Negro has given to America? And I personally believe that the Negro or the African American behavior today has a lot to do with not being able to identify that lost gift.
Who wants to answer that?
Well, I don't know how to answer that. I'm not a cultural studies person per se, but I think, you know, I guess, you know, music is important, right, in terms of thinking about African diaspora studies, which is, you know, Gilroy uses it quite a bit, actually, in terms of thinking about routes and about the making of diasporic identity. And so, and a lot of people have followed suit in thinking about that, especially when you think about Africanisms and so on.
I would like to just recommend a book. I'm not sure if someone here may have seen it or not. The title of it is Horror and Beauty: The Rhythm and Business of Black. The rhythm and business of the black economy, or the music rhythm. Excuse me. The rhythm and business, the political economy of black music. And it points out in the book about how President Bush, I think he brought the name of the Black Music Month in June into being. And he talked about how good it is to enjoy, but hard to emulate. And also the music industry today in America is fueled by the old sorrow songs that you find in Alabama, Mississippi, and in Georgia. And I believe that today America is going to have to face the fact that this very music is the area which is going to bring healing to this country in the ways that we are suffering today. But that's the book.
Thanks.
Yes.
Professor Luis, over here.
I want to thank all the panelists for wonderful and stimulating presentations, and certainly the topic is very open, and my attempt is to open it even further. And I want to start out by talking about, which is something that Debbie talked about, which is the going back to the Dominican Republic, the remigration, but the remigration to Africa, not only in terms of the U.S. presence, Liberia, but also in the 19th century, Abacuas in Cuba was sent back to Fernando Po, and the kind of impact that this remigration, that we certainly have we've studied the impact that Africans have in the New World, but then what about the impact that in this remigration they have back in Africa? And this has been in some respects documented. So this remigration, I think it's something that we need to also look at. And then the other idea that comes to mind, well, remigration to Africa, but remigration to any country back. Again, there's something to be said about that. And then the other idea that comes to mind, and in terms of speaking of hegemonic powers and other types of migration, I'm thinking of the Chinese and the Chinese presence and the migrations of Chinese throughout the world, and in particular Africa, certainly Latin America, U.S., but the Chinese presence in Africa, and how and what kinds of experiences they brought to Africa, and certainly in the contemporary period, you know, with China's a superpower, and it's taking the resources and controlling resources in Africa is I think is part of this maybe double layered migration or at least in the second stage of much more of a control. Before there were Chinese who were just leaving China, mainly from southern China to other parts of the world, but some of them were taken to work in Africa, in particular South Africa. But then I'm also thinking about this other movement of people through the Silk Route that went from Xi'an to Turpan and into Arabia and Turkey, and then into Africa as well, and how people moved along this Silk Route from these other parts of the world into China, and the kinds of impacts they've had. So I guess I want to go both ways and see how certainly focus on the African diaspora, but there have been other kinds of movements that have been taking place, and how these other movements, what do they tell us about those movements that can help us understand further the African diaspora, the movement of people, and how the African diaspora can also help us understand the other types of movements.
That's a big question.
Perhaps
a short answer. I'll leave the longer answer to you if you'd like. But the short answer of the difference obviously has something to do with limited movement as well, restricted movement or forced migration versus different sorts of migrations that were by choice or by certain kinds of opportunities. But I would say the African diasporic movement, it's not only through the slave trade, but that is in part something that limited or forced movement to be one way, at least initially, but then, like Jemima was saying, that's very important to think about the ways in which remigration helps us to shift that conversation, and it opens up the dialogue to think about African migration within the context of these larger movements across diaspora. So I guess I want us to be attentive to the forced versus voluntary migrations in thinking about that. But
don't all look at me for the long answer. I mean, what I would focus on is not necessarily answering your question in terms of what this tells us about the African diaspora, but what this tells us about sort of studying nation and diaspora, which means that we can focus on certain. Well, we need to focus on interactions and those interactions aren't necessarily between two groups, whether it's, I mean, the African diaspora is itself a generalization that encompasses migration from multiple different places to other different multiple places, and the continuing influx of new immigrants who then are in contact and become part of a community with other, and then lumped together in this African diaspora, but there also are in connections with other diasporas or other diasporic populations on the ground, Jamaica or in other places. So I think it's the attentiveness to sort of the particularities of patterns of migration and interactions in different sites that need to be foregrounded and sort of just need to remind us to study the multiple dimensions of phenomena rather than sort of focusing on one aspect of it.
And I would just add that something I think you're gesturing to in that comment, which I think is important, is that there's something about Chinese migration in the late 20th century that was also linked to capital formation. And then investment in Africa has seen a good deal of that investment. And I don't know the history of that well enough to spell it out, but what we want to do when we talk about globalization and diaspora as part of that and all that stuff is to be mindful of the relations of capital and labor. And so I think that you're pointing to that as you're asking us to think about Chinese migration.
And I think that was preceded.
Wait for the mic.
Sorry. Thank you. I think, and that was preceded in Africa by what was called the Asian presence from the Indian subcontinent in Pakistan, which resulted in Idi Amin expelling that group. And you still see a tremendous influence in East Africa, particularly in trading. Some manufacture, but largely trading. And I'm speaking from personal experience of going into stores in Nairobi or other places in East Africa and having the Africans wait on me, but the Asian hand always went out for the money. And so there was a mercantile class or trading class, and below were a population that did the menial work.
Okay, I think, right, 4:29 I can see on the screen. And that's a fast one. So, slow. So we're at our conclusion both of this session and of the serious academic part of this conference, and it gives me the honor to thank the director, Mona Frederick as well, and everybody who's assisted in this event and in attending this event. Thank you all very much.